Okay, good morning. So we're back, Baruch Hashem, and with Hashem's help, it'll be simchas for everyone. Okay, we are on Memhei Amud Aleph 45a. What we're looking at right now is the Gemara compared the language of the verse as it describes the unresolved murder that's found out of the city, which begins the process of the Egla Rufa, right? They find the unresolved corpse, and they have to bring the elders from Jerusalem, which we described at great length, who that is and what that is and how many. And then once they measure the distance to the nearest city, they bring out the elders from that city and they begin the process where there is the atonement and the decapitated calf and so on. So the Gemara compared the language describing where the verse describes the finding of the corpse, which is Ki motzei cholol ba'adama. When you find the corpse, be'adama. Adama means earth, and be, the question is, what does be mean? The be is the prefix. Does it mean inside or upon? Now, our Mishnah said it means on the earth, and therefore, if you found it buried, you found the corpse buried, or you found the corpse hanging from a tree, then the law does not apply because it is on the water. The law doesn't apply because it's not on the field, not on the ground. And the Gemara, the Mishnah did not bring any countering view, which left us to conclude that this is the view. That's it. This is the way we understand it. Be'adama means on the ground. But the Gemara introduced the fact that there's another time the verse uses this be, this letter beis, as a prefix, and there is a dispute. Understood exactly the opposite. It's referring to the verse describing the law of Shikcha, the law of forgotten sheaves and to be left for the poor. Now there's a double expression, which we're going to get to today. And again, the same prefix, the beis. So the verse reads, it's verse 19 in chapter 24 of Devarim, of Deuteronomy. So you have it there on the left of your page. If you give me a second, I'll show it to you. Here, where it says the Vav, that's the verse right there. The bottom left corner. Okay. The Vav, where it says, just the opening words is the main point. Ki siktzar k'tzircha b'sadcha. When you cut your harvest in the field, again, this letter beis, v'shachachta omer, and you forget a sheaf, basada, in the field. So twice, in your field and then in the field. First describing the harvesting and then describing the forgetting. But in each case, the verse says, in the field or in your field. So there, the Mishnah tells us on this verse that there is a dispute. Does in the field mean literally inside the field? And thus, even if you found a sheaf buried beneath the ground, the law of Shikcha applies and it's to be left for the poor. If that's where you lost it, that's where you forgot it. Or on the contrary, no. Bisada means on the field. And if you found it buried, the law of Shikcha does not apply. Or if it was forgotten if it was forgotten buried in the ground, it does not apply. And therefore you get to keep it. So there, the Gemara, the Mishnah disputed, it was, back to the Gemara here, it was Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, Chacham, the sages, unqualified who? Rabbi Yehuda and the sages, as to whether it means in or on. Rabbi Yehuda said it means on, and therefore if you found if the sheaf was left behind, buried in the ground, the law of forgetting doesn't apply. And the sages said it means in the field, literally. And even if you found it buried, the law of Shikcha applies and it belongs to the poor. So the Gemara first wanted to suggest.
You just said Rabbi Yehuda buried in the ground? No.
He said
on the ground.
On the ground?
Okay. But I heard you say buried in the ground after you were quoting it.
Sorry, yeah. Rabbi Yehuda says it means on, and therefore if it's in, the law of Shikcha does not apply, and thus you keep it. Rabbi Yehuda, the sages say it means in the field, and therefore, if it's lost and forgotten, buried in the field, then the law of Shikcha does apply and it belongs to the poor. So the Gemara suggested perhaps the same dispute applies to finding the corpse be'adama, in the ground or on the ground, which on the surface level was a good suggestion because very good. On the surface, it's a good comparison because we're talking about how do you translate the prefix base, in or on. So it should be universal. The problem becomes when it comes to the law of Egla Rufa, the Mishnah introduces no countering opinion. The Mishnah just says be means on, and if it's buried, and if you find the corpse buried in the ground, the law of Egla Rufa does not apply.
So you're saying that because the Mishnah didn't raise a counter argument, therefore
the assumption
should not have.
Not the Gemara should have not, but the Gemara pushes farther. The Gemara pushes farther and tries to reconcile that no matter what your opinion is regarding the reading of Shikcha, your reading of Egla Rufa will mean on and not in, no matter how you read Shikcha. How's that? So the Gemara told us it's not a question of how you translate the word in or on, but it's a question of context. What do you know before? And therefore, based on that, the bays will either include or exclude. Not a question of how you translate it, but a question of what do you know before? So the verse says, Ki motzei chalal, when you find the corpse. That's an unqualified statement. And therefore, if it just said that, when you find a corpse, without the word on the ground, or be'adama, or in the ground, whichever one, and the verse only said when you find the corpse, it would mean you find the corpse anywhere. Who cares? And therefore, if the verse says be'adama, in the ground, it's coming to exclude something. Because before we had that word, everything was included. Because it was an unqualified statement. When you find a corpse, anytime, regardless of circumstance. If the verse then adds a word, then it's coming to exclude something. Well, what's it coming to exclude? On the ground, not in the ground. But when it comes to the little forgotten sheaf, the verse said, we saw the double expression. The verse begins by saying, when you gather your harvest in the field. Well, where's harvest done? But not buried, on the field. And therefore, without the second time where it says in the field, the assumption is only on, not in. And therefore, if there's an added word, it's coming to include something, even if it's buried.
It's the opposite.
It's the opposite. Because it's not a question of how you translate the letter bays. It's a question of, is this an inclusive or an exclusive redundancy?
How's the verse?
And that depends on the context.
In order to give meaning.
That's right. What do I know before this word? If what I know before is all-inclusive, then this extra word is exclusive. If what I know before is to begin with exclusive, then this word is inclusive. And therefore, because of the double expression there, right? Go back to the verse by Shikcha. It says when you gather your harvest Sotah in your field. That means above, not in, because you don't harvest under the ground. And then it says, and you forgot a sheaf. Had that been all it said, then I would say the forgotten sheaf is in context of where you harvest, namely above ground.
Perhaps that's why the Mishnah didn't raise that.
That's correct. That's exactly Gemara's point. But because the verse added Sotah in the field a second time, it's coming to include something.
Even if it's buried
inside. Because if it was only above ground, I knew that before the word Sotah. I would have known that without the word Sotah. Okay. So now the question becomes, so this is all the view of the sages. Because the view of the sages is that the word Sotah by Shikcha is coming to include the fact that it's buried in the ground.
You can't just look at the letter bait and give it a meaning of whether it's in or on.
Without the context. That's correct.
The arrangement of the verse.
That's correct. What do I know before, and what's this base telling me? If what I know before is inclusive, then this base is exclusive. And if I know before is exclusive, then this base is inclusive. Right? But that's all the view of the sages, who state that there's a distinction between the law or there's a distinction, right? That when it comes to Egla Rufa, if you find the corpse buried in the ground, the law does not apply. When it comes to the forgotten sheaf, if the forgotten sheaf was forgotten in the ground, the law does apply. But Rabbi Yehuda says they're both the same. Rabbi Yehuda says in both cases, it's only when it's found or lost above ground and not in the ground.
For the sheaves as well.
The sheaves as well. So the question becomes, why doesn't he have the same context?
He doesn't seem to apply the same laws of the exegesis.
The question is why? This is where we are. Sorry, exegesis. Sorry? That's the word. Okay, so this is where we are. So the line begins with the word basada, and the fifth word is Rabbi Yehuda. So if you go from the widest set of lines, you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, down. So go to the beginning of the widest set of lines. And then the line begins with the word basada, and the fifth word is Rabbi Yehuda. Maybe it's one more line down. Yeah, you see it there, Robert? Do you have it there? The fifth word, the line begins with the word basada, and the fifth word is Rabbi Yehuda.
Yeah. Right.
So Rabbi Yehuda, in Rabbi Yehuda's view, where he says that when it comes to Egla Rufa, everybody agrees that if you find the corpse buried in the ground, the law doesn't apply because it's got to be on the ground, not in.
Because of the cloud.
That's correct. Well, no, because yes. Well, we don't know, but yes.
Okay.
And then the same thing applies by Shikcha. He has the consistent reading of Bays. Right? The Chachamim put it in context. Or at least as we assume right now. Right? The Yehuda has a consistent translation of the letter Bays without giving it the context. Just by Egla Rufa, it says Be'adama, on the ground, not in the ground. And when it says, and you forgot the sheaf in the field and not on the field and not in the field, not buried in.
Using the context.
The base.
Of the
no context, just letter base. Just the letter base. The same base. Just the letter base. The question then becomes, according to Yehuda, Nami as well, typically, let him derive that we exclude finding buried in the ground. Let him learn that. From the context that lost sheaves is similar to where you harvest your sheaves. That's how the verse opens up. The verse opens up by saying, when you gather your harvest and you forgot a sheaf. So seemingly the context already tells you that it's only above ground and not in the ground. Why does he rely on the base to teach us that? The sages, which give us that context, rely on the base to actually include buried in the ground. But the Yehuda, which excludes buried in the ground, why doesn't he leave that exclusion from the context? Why would you need the extra base to tell us that? Says the Gemara, Ein hachanami. Indeed, that's the case. He does learn from the context. He learns from the context that the same place where the harvest happens, that's where the forgetting happens. Well, if that's the case, why do you need the extra base?
Right.
If you're using the context,
it's free to be.
It's free for interpretation.
And it's not being used.
It's not being used for anything. It's a problem. So in the sage's view, where the context tells you that you only above ground, the bisada, the extra bisada tells you even in the ground. But according to Yehuda, to begin with, you don't include in the ground. So you already know from the context that in the ground is excluded. So what's the extra bisada for?
He's excluding it, right?
He's excluding the in the ground.
In the ground, right? But how? Right.
So we assumed he excluded it from the letter base, but now we know context already does that. So what's the base for? What's the extra bisada?
It's in the context of the first base.
That's correct.
Second.
So what's it exactly?
That's what the sages are saying.
Exactly right. So if the question becomes in Yehuda ve'ela, but bisada lamali, why do I need this extra in the field? You already know from the context that that you don't include stuff buried in the ground. So why the second time it says basada? It could have said when you gather your harvest in your field and you forget a sheaf, leave it. Why would you forget a sheaf in the field? Why that second in the field? So according to the sages, that extra in the field is come to tell you that even if it's lost inside the ground, but the Yehuda doesn't include that.
He still holds.
But he still holds in the ground is not part of it. So what's the extra in the field for?
Does he say? Or
So yeah, what Gemara is about to tell us. Okay. The Gemara says, he needs it, the rabbis, to include Shikchas Kama, a forgotten stalk. Not a sheaf, but a stalk. So it's just the stalk of, where's that, Rashi?
it's one piece. A sheaf is a bundle.
A sheaf is a bundle. That's right.
Of 10 or more, I think.
Actually, the way Rashi says it is, the sheaf, the stalk is actually still attached to the ground. Still attached to the ground. So you forget a sheaf. So in other words, like this. You forget a sheaf in the field, even if that sheaf is still attached to your field.
Does it require tithing if it's still attached to the ground? That's not.
That's not a question of tithe. It doesn't belong to you. You don't tithe from it. It doesn't belong to you. If you're leaving it behind for the poor, then you're not even, doesn't belong to you to begin with to take tithe from.
Right.
So this is how we read the verse. Ki Shikcha, what's the opening lines? Ki Shikcha ksircha basada. When you reap your harvest in the field, and you forget a sheaf, that already tells you forgotten sheaf. And if it's buried in the ground, it's not included because it's only relevant to harvest, and harvest doesn't happen in the ground. But then the verse says, bisada, even if that forgotten sheaf are still stalks that are attached to your ground, even that should not be you should not go back to collect that, leave that for the poor.
And what's interesting is part of it's underground.
No, so underground is not included. Oh, part of it's underground because it's attached to the ground. Right. So the bisada means it's still attached to your field, and yet you still don't go back to collect it.
You don't.
You don't go back to collect it. It's
still in the ground.
So the point here is not, the language is in your field, meaning it's still part of your field. You haven't harvested yet. That too should be left behind. Yeah, so that's Shikchas Kama. The forgotten stalks that are still attached to the ground. That's what Rashi learns.
That's what Rabbi Yehud is relying on for that second base.
That's correct. That second bisada in your field. The question becomes then, well, how do the sages know that that's part of the law? They have no extra word that's free for interpretation. So how do they derive that?
It includes the stalks.
That includes the stalks that you forgot behind. Yeah, we're going back and forth until we find where's the actual word that our letter that they're arguing on, right?
Right.
So let's see. The Rabbanon and the sages.
I just have a quick question.
Sure.
If the stalk wasn't, because it says the verse talks about harvested, and you forgot something you harvested.
Yeah.
Something that hasn't been actually cut from the ground, is that deemed? But you intended it to be. Is that deemed to be harvested?
Okay, so the Mishnah goes through all the various. The Mishnah in the laws of, in the tractate of Peya, I think it is, goes through the details of what's considered forgotten and at what point is it behind you, is it in front of you?
Right.
Are you still going to get there? Did you pass it or not pass it? Okay. So all the details are there. And in Rambam, obviously. Okay, so for Rabbanon, the sages, Shikchas Kama, forgotten stalks that are still attached to the ground. Minalahu, where do they derive it from? Where do they derive that too is included in the law of the forgotten crops, I guess, and therefore it's included in the prohibition, lo yisashav lakachta, don't go back and take it, which is the continuation of this verse. How do they know it's part of it? Because in their view, the word basada in the field comes to tell you that if it's buried in the ground, it's part of the shikcha.
Right.
So from where do they derive that if it's still attached to the ground, it's stuck, as part of the ground, it too is forbidden to go back and collect. The sages, Rabbi Yehuda, which said if it's buried in the ground, is not part of Shikcha. So he has the extra word basada to tell you that forgotten stalks that are attached to the ground are part of the law. But the sages already use that word to tell you if it's forgotten in the ground, buried in the ground, it's part of the law.
Right. So how did they come to include the stalks?
How do they come to include the stalks? So answers the Gemara, Nafkalhu. They derive it when you forget from the opening, from the first Besada. The first Besada, you'll remember, doesn't say on the field. It says, right, there's 2 times it said in the field.
Right.
The first time it said in your field. In your field. It didn't have to do that. All right. Well, okay, we'll get that actually. Okay, we'll get to that in a second. The detail of your field we'll get to in a second. Sorry. But the fact that it says the first time around in your field already tells you that it's anything on the field, including that which is attached. So
including
that's right. When you collect your harvest in your field, which means the forgotten stuff could either be a sheaf or that which is in your field.
That's how they derive.
That's how they derive even the attached stalks.
Okay.
And the second in the field is come to tell you in the ground. So now the question becomes, what does Rabbi Yehuda need the first in your field for? In other words, the verse could have not said field at all. It could have said, when you gather your harvest and you forget, without saying field at all. But it says twice field.
Well, did he use one for the sheaves on the ground?
So one for the sheaves on the ground.
For the stalks.
No, well, in the ground is not part of it already, according to his view.
The stalks.
So one for the stalks. What's the other one for?
For the sheaves.
What sheaves? The sheaves itself, if Shikcha Omer, you forget a sheaf. That's already stated explicitly. And you forget the sheaf. It could have said, when you're gathering your harvest and you forget a sheaf, without the word field at all. Okay, so the second in your field comes to tell you,
according to Rabbi Yehuda.
According to Rabbi Yehuda, the second in your field comes to tell you that it includes stalks.
Stalks, right.
From the fact that it says harvest, we already know it excludes in the ground because harvest is always above ground. So what's the first in your field for? In Rabbi Yehuda's view. In the sage's view, the first in your field is to tell you it includes stalks. The second in your field comes to tell you it includes that which is buried in the ground. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, buried in the ground is not part of the law, which therefore means the second in the field comes to tell you stalks. The first in your field doesn't tell you anything yet. The fact that it excludes that which is buried in the ground is because of the context of harvest. Harvest itself is only above ground. Following? So according to Rabbi Yehuda, what's the first in your field for?
First one was for the on the ground. That's how I was understanding it.
That's from the fact that it's harvest. And the fact that the Torah describes it as forgetting during harvest means it's above ground. Nothing to do with field.
It's a different word, harvest.
When you harvest your harvest. That itself tells you it's above ground. Because harvest itself contextually is above ground. So why in the field? So according to the sages,
in your field.
Okay, the your we'll get to in a second. But first we'll start with the fact that it says in field twice. Okay. So according to the sages, the first in field is to tell you we're including harvest. And the second in field is coming to tell you even buried in the ground. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's not considered, buried in the ground is already excluded from the fact that it says harvest. And contextually harvest is only above ground. In field second time tells you the stalks. In field first time tells you what? We don't know yet. Says the Gemara of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda Maboyla, he requires the first time that it says in the field, to teach us a law that Rabbi Yehuda taught us. Rabbi Lezer, which he said the name of Rabbi Lezer. To Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Bo said the name of Rabbi Lezer as follows. From the fact that the Torah says, in your field, prat, this excludes, safu oimrin, when sheaves or stalk something floats from your neighbor's field into your field. But by the air, it's lightweight and the air blows it over. The language here is literally floats. But the point here is actually that's not on the ground. It's floating in from your neighbor's field.
Catch it in midair.
Can the poor person catch in midair? Yeah. And Rashi says it's not on the ground yet. It's on a stone, or it's on a beam, or it's stacked upon other things. It's not on the ground of your field yet. So it's floating from somebody else's, and it's hovering above the ground, either on a rock or on a stone or stacked on other crops. Yeah. So the question then becomes, yeah. So now we have the answer to how what Rabbi Huda uses the two in your fields for. Following?
Yeah, the second one's for stocks.
The second one for stocks. The first one to say that if it's hovering and not on the field, it's only when bisatcha when it's on your field. Because it was not on your field yet, because it's on a rock or it's on the beam, it's excluded from the law of Shikcha, and therefore you can take it.
He's very consistent with the laws of Egler so far, right? It's only
that's correct.
Not
only
if it's hanging in the tree or
that's correct.
Because that would be akin to the hovering.
That's correct. That's correct. Now the question becomes, what do the sages do? How do the sages derive this law? Because the sages use the first bisatcha to tell you it includes stocks. The second bisatcha to tell you that it includes something buried in the ground. So how do they derive to exclude that which is hovering? Answers the Gemara.
Maybe they want to include because they.
Well, we have no source that tells us to dispute this law, right? It's a law that has no challenger, so we assume that they agree with it too. Otherwise, the original source that told us this law would say, "Well, there's another opinion." Right? So says the Gemara of Rabbanan, the sages, besada besatcha. They derive from the fact that the verse says your field and not the field. That's correct, because this is yours. It's not from your field. It's from a different field. So now the sages therefore have three things to derive from: your field, infield, and then infield. Three things. Your field to exclude that which is floating. Infield of the your field tell you even stocks. And then the second time when it says infield is to include in the ground. Rabbi Huda only has two infields. The first infield to exclude hovering, and the second infield to include stocks. And the fact that it's buried in the ground, well, buried in the ground is not part of the law because it says harvest, and harvest means above ground.
The sages do with the word harvest. Is that something?
So the sages actually did it the other way around, because the sages said, because it started off by saying harvest, which means only above ground, the fact that later it says in field means it's coming to include something. So they use the context to set up the exclusion at the end. Or the inclusion at the end. Yeah. So now the question becomes, what does Rabbi Huda do with the fact that it says your field instead of the field? Says the Gemara, Rabbi Huda, Rabbi Huda does not derive anything, or he doesn't care for the fact that the verse changes from in the field to in your field. What would be the reason? Perhaps this is the reason. And we had a similar thing earlier. Because there's no extra letter, whether you say in your field or the field. You just change the hey into a chaf. Beis bisada, spelled beis sin dalad hey, that's 4 letters. And bisatcha in your field is beis sin dalad chaf. So Yehuda might say, I can't derive anything from in your field or the field because the Torah is not saving anything one way or the other. We had a similar thing earlier. When was it? Where no, the vav is an extra letter, but there was another time where wait. Oh, we had it with your judges.
Oh,
the judges or your judges would be the same amount of letters, whereas the elders versus your elders.
Your comes to tell you it's higher level,
or the other way around. Sorry, right. Your comes to tell you higher level, but the Gemara only derived one your, not the other your, because one your, there was no extra letter to make it your. It was a change of a letter. Right? Zekanim versus Zekenecha. Whereas Shoftim and Shoftecha, one of them changed, one of them didn't. I don't remember which one was, but right, which one was it? Go back.
That would also be a change of only a letter, right? Shoftim,
yes, but
or is it additional? No.
What was it? V'yatzu. No. Oh, sorry. It's not hash. It's not zekanim. It's v'yatzu ziknei. The elders versus zikenecha. Your elders. It's an extra chaf. When it comes to shoftim, it's not shoftei. It's shoftim or shoftecha, where there's no change in amount of letters. Whereas here too, also no change in amount of letters, Sotah or Sotah. So that the sages say, okay, well, look, change in language, even if it means no extra letter, is worthy of derivation.
That's what their opinion.
That's right. And the Buddha says, not worthy of derivation because we didn't save anything. And only when we could have saved something and we didn't, now we have a reason for derivation. So this therefore concludes the two different readings of how you derive the law of Shikcha, but both of them agree in Egla Rufa. That was the whole point of this whole exercise.
They both agree.
They both agree that Egla Rufa means on the field, not in the field. Because in context, there's no reason to make that in the field inclusive. It's exclusive. The verse starts off with when you find the corpse anywhere, and therefore the Adama is coming to exclude that which is buried in the ground. But when it comes to the laws of Shikcha, of forgotten sheaves, there's much more to be dealt with here. There's two extra words in your field, in the field, and then you might even have a third, which is in your versus the. To say Rabbi only has two, in field, in your field, only two. One to include sheaves, and one to exclude that which is floating. And as for the fact that, and as for in the ground, Rabbi Huda says in the ground is not part of it because it says harvest, and harvest is to begin with above ground. And the sages have three. The sages say, well, harvest gives us the context that we're talking about above ground, which therefore means when the verse says in field, we're coming to include something new, which is inside the ground. The other in your field comes to exclude that which is floating. And the fact that it says the other in your field is going to include stalks. And the fact that it says your excludes floating. Whereas Rabbi Huda doesn't derive anything from the fact that it changes from the to your. So this really closes that up. But because the Gemara raised the discussion on floating sheaves, the Gemara is going to discuss that a little bit more. We're going to be discussing this business with floating sheaves in our field.
Is that there's no change in the number of letters, and it's only no addition to letters to words.
It's the change of.
And is that split down the middle in the Gemara in terms of two camps? On that
it's possible, but that's the problem with not knowing the whole Gemara by heart. So I'm sure there are those out there who are much smarter than me who figured that kind of thing out, and possibly, but to make an unqualified statement like that,
so important to.
Yeah, I'm sure you can find some sort of consistency with this, but someone would have to really know all of Shas to be able to be authoritatively say such a thing. Okay, you have a wonderful day and a good Chodesh. Wish you simchas together, God willing.